All right, welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into a really fascinating, maybe slightly unnerving concept that you sent our way. It's this idea that history isn't just, a chaotic mess of stuff happening, but that it moves in these deeply ingrained, interconnected cycles. Think of it less like random events and more like, well, cosmic clockwork driving human drama.
hmm And we've got a couple of key sources guiding us today.
Yeah, first there's an article that lays out a whole framework proposing this multi-layered view suggesting everything, from solar flares to societal shifts, kind of dances to these cyclical rhythms. And then accompanying that, we have a visual source, a graph. It's titled Global Convergence of Historical Cycles and Manipulated Events. And it attempts to actually show these patterns playing out over centuries, highlighting moments where different forces seem to collide.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is really to unpack these sources with you. We want to understand the core claims they're making,
Hmm.
examine the evidence presented, especially that graph, and then apply some critical thinking to the whole framework they propose. It's about trying to cut through the complexity, get the essential knowledge quickly but thoroughly, looking for those patterns, and maybe finding those aha moments that help you see the world a little differently.
Exactly. The foundational idea presented in this article is that everything operates in nested cycles, which they describe pretty vividly as being like gears inside gears.
Yeah.
So whether it's wars, economic crashes, even things as far removed as like solar flares or shifts in technology, it's all part of these repeating, interacting patterns. Okay, let's unpack
Right.
this.
That's right. The article's central argument is basically that you can't truly grasp the sweep of history, but just looking at one factor in isolation. You need to see the convergence of multiple distinct cyclical patterns happening, simultaneously. They don't just identify one cycle. They propose 7 key types that, in their view, drive historical events.
7 distinct cycles. Wow. Influencing everything. That's quite the symphony. I'm really curious about the different types they highlight. Let's maybe walk through them. The first one they mentioned ties into these big cosmic forces, solar or cosmic cycles.
Yes, the source suggests these cycles operate over periods like 11, 22, 88, or even, get this, 206 years. And they claim these cycles don't just influence the obvious things like climate, crop yields, or volcanic activity, but also, surprisingly, even mass psychological states. They propose that disruptions in the geomagnetic field might actually affect our collective mood and cognition.
Huh. Sunspots making us collectively agitated. That's a pretty wild claim. The article backs this up with examples, though, like linking the 1816 year without a summer to a combo of volcanic eruption and low solar activity. And they make a very specific, timely prediction. They claim solar cycle 25 is peaking around 2025 and is already influencing geopolitical aggression. So watch the sun, watch the news, according to this source anyway.
Hmm. From the celestial, we then kind of descend to the collective human experience. The next type is generational or societal cycles, and this draws on frameworks like Strauss and Howe's fourth turning theory.
Ah, the fourth turning. That's the one typically pegged at roughly 80 to 100 years, right? And it moves through distinct social moods or phases, like a crisis, then a period of stability or high, then an awakening, then an unraveling where things fall apart a bit, and then it loops back to crisis.
Precisely. And the source asserts that we are currently living through the end stages of a crisis phase. They explicitly compare the last one, which they date from 1929 to 1946, to our current era, which they place from 2008 extending to around 2029. Their core claim here is that the end of this specific cycle phase tends to precipitate a massive societal reset, often accompanied by major conflict or restructuring. So if they're right, we are deep in the reset zone right now.
Okay, so generational tension leading to a major reset by the end of this decade, according to this framework. Shifting gears again, what about the big money movements? Economics.
Next up are the economic debt or credit cycles. Here they reference economic thinkers like Ray Dalio and Nikolai Kondratiev. These typically span an approximate period of, say, 50 to 70 years.
Right, the familiar pattern of credit expansion, building up to a peak, then a collapse, often intertwined with geopolitical events like war or a complete system reset. It sounds familiar.
Exactly. And this is where the source makes another very pointed claim. They assert we are currently at the culmination of the fourth global debt supercycle. Drawing a parallel to the last major cycle end in the 1930s and 40s, they predict the collapse phase of this current supercycle is specifically expected to occur around 2025 to 2028.
Wow. That's a pretty concrete and near-term prediction tied to this particular cycle. Specific dates for a potential economic collapse, that definitely stands out. What's next on this list of cyclical forces?
We move to the really grand scale now, with civilizational epoch cycles. These reference vast historical theories from thinkers like Spengler and Toynbee, and even ancient systems like the Hindu Yuga system.
These are the truly massive waves, right? Spanning maybe 1,000 to 2,500 years. The birth of a civilization, its growth, peak, decline, decay, and ultimately collapse. Big picture stuff.
Right. And the source makes a pretty bold assertion here. They claim that Western civilization in particular is currently deep in a stage of decay and rapidly approaching collapse. They link this perspective to nearing the end of the Kali Yuga, if you're familiar with that specific framing, often interpreted as an age of degradation and conflict, but also seen by some as a prelude to a kind of techno-spiritual rebirth. So that's a picture of breakdown, but with a potential for transformation on the other side, on a millennial scale.
Okay, so a long-term civilizational decline potentially converging with shorter-term debt and generational crises. That's intense. What about something as fundamental as, well, food?
That brings us nicely to agricultural and famine cycles. These are primarily driven by climatic factors and trade disruptions, with a suggested period of maybe 200 to 400 years.
And the source makes a direct link here between food security collapse and the collapse of empires, claiming this pattern repeats throughout history. They list historical examples like the catastrophic 1315, 1317 Great Famine, widespread famines in the 1690s, the difficulties in 1816, and the U.S. Dust Bowl in the 1930s.
And echoing their predictions from other cycles, they draw a parallel to what they call current echoes, pointing to a perceived famine risk and critical fertilizer issues, specifically between 2023 and 2030. So another near-term warning tied to a historical cycle.
Yeah, that's a pretty stark picture emerging, connecting cosmic events, social moods, debt, civilizational decline, and even food security. Wow. How about the rapid pace of technological change we're seeing? Does that fit in?
Absolutely. The source includes technological paradigm shift cycles, concepts familiar from thinkers like Kondratiev or Schumpeter. These operate on a faster cycle, roughly 40 to 60 years.
Right, the waves of fundamental innovation that reshape society.
Yeah.
You know, the age of water power, then steam, electricity, oil, semiconductors, that kind of thing.
Exactly. The source claims we are currently entering a new wave, focused around AI and what they actually term bio-sovereignty. And they add a specific, quite notable claim about this particular shift. They assert that the current elite don't control this one the way they controlled previous ones.
That's a fascinating and somewhat loaded claim. Who are these elite they keep mentioning, and what does it mean that they allegedly don't control this tech wave? Does that connect to the final type of cycle they introduce? It feels like it might.
It does, very directly. The seventh type is called manipulated narrative cycles. These are explicitly described by the source as being artificial cycles with a shorter period of maybe 10 to 30 years.
Artificial. So not organic patterns, but deliberately created. By whom?
Well, the article explicitly states these cycles are created by manipulation groups. Their purpose, according to the source, is very specific, to reset or redirect public perception. They list examples like false flags, economic panics, cultural revolutions, virus releases. Pretty provocative stuff.
Okay, wow. This is where the source introduces the idea of intentional human agency, maybe even malice, alongside the seemingly natural cosmic or economic forces. They're claiming these events aren't random crises, but deliberate actions.
Exactly. And the source's core contention for this cycle is that these manipulated narratives and events are overlaid onto the natural cycles. They're specifically timed and designed, they claim, to steer the chaos created by those natural cycle convergences towards maintaining elite continuity. It's a theory that really blends natural patterns with deliberate social engineering.
So the picture is one of natural forces creating instability, and then certain groups allegedly exploiting that instability with deliberate actions to secure their power.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a lot to process. 7 different types of cycles, some natural, some allegedly manipulated, all potentially interacting and converging. Okay, let's transition now to that visual source you provided the graph titled Global Convergence of Historical Cycles and Manipulated Events, 1300-2020. This seems to be the article's attempt to, show all these ideas in action across nearly 700 years.
Yes, it's basically their visual argument for the convergence theory. Let's try and paint a picture of it for you. Across the bottom, the horizontal x-axis, you've got the year, starting way back in 1300 and running all the way up to 2020. Then, up the side, the vertical y-axis is a scale labeled event intensity, 1 to 5. So the graph is trying to quantify and track how intense certain types of historical events were in any given period according to their model.
Right.
And the graph itself is filled with multiple colored lines weaving across it. Each color represents a different type of event, and there's a legend explaining them. We see lines for things like solar activity, crop failures, major wars, economic crises, currency debasement, central bank events, commodity price shocks, mass migrations, and inflation. As you move across time on the x-axis, these lines fluctuate up and down, visually charting the intensity score assigned to that event type by the source over the centuries.
And what immediately jumps out are these striking vertical pink shaded areas running up the graph at various points in history. What do those seem to represent? They're quite prominent.
Yeah, they really are. Based on the graph's title and the way the lines behave within them, these pink zones appear to highlight periods where multiple events and presumably the underlying cycles driving them are converging at high-intensity levels. We're talking levels typically reaching intensity 4 or 5 on that scale they've created.
Right. You can visually see that within those pink zones, there's a clear clustering of high points, those dots where many of the colored lines peak simultaneously or very close together. It looks like the graph is marking out specific eras throughout history where multiple major crises or shifts happened all at once. You see these intense peaks clustered around, say, the 1300s, then again around the 1500s, the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, and notably there's a very pronounced clustering leading towards the very end of the graph in the late 20th and early 21st century. It definitely visually supports their idea of rhythmic converging crises.
So, connecting the graph back to the article, it provides that visual representation of the core thesis, that historical cycles converge, leading to these concentrated periods of intense overlapping events. It's their attempt to show the rhythmic pattern they're describing, not just talk about it.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. We've laid out this comprehensive, multi-layered framework from the article, and we've seen its visual argument in the graph. It's a lot to absorb, and it presents a very powerful, maybe even deterministic way of seeing history. Let's unpack this deeper. What's most fascinating, maybe even compelling, about this whole approach?
Well, what's fascinating here is the sheer ambition and scope of the framework, I think. It attempts to create a truly holistic, interconnected view of history. It's trying to link phenomena as diverse as sunspots, economic policies, agricultural output, civilizational trends, technological innovation, and even these claims of deliberate manipulation.
What?
All into a single, unified system of cycles. It's not just looking at one piece of the puzzle, right? It's trying to show how all the gears are turning together. It's really attempting to see the entire forest, not just, individual trees.
That integrated vision is definitely compelling, I agree. But so what does this all mean if we try and connect this to the bigger picture? How much of this is a genuinely predictable pattern that can be mapped and maybe used to forecast the future? And how much is, perhaps, looking back at history through the lens of cycles and interpreting past events to fit the pattern you already expect to find? Does the theory emerge from the data, or is the data being selected and interpreted to support the theory?
That raises an important question, definitely, particularly about that graph. The graph clearly shows that many different types of intense events correlate and cluster in time. You can see that visually. But does that visual correlation prove that these underlying cycles cause those events? The graph shows things lining up, yeah, but as we always say, correlation isn't necessarily causation. And, how reliable are those event intensity scores anyway? How is a major war in, say, the 14th century objectively compared on a 1 to 5 scale to an economic crisis in the 20th? How much subjectivity is baked into quantifying these vastly different historical events?
Yeah, that scoring system does seem like a potential area for, bias or interpretation to creep in, doesn't it? And what about the elephant in the room, the integration of the manipulated narrative cycles? The source explicitly lists things like false flags and virus releases, right alongside natural phenomena like solar activity or inherent generational shifts. This suggests that some crises aren't organic cyclical occurrences at all, but deliberate artificial actions. How does deliberate manipulation by these groups fit into a theory that largely describes history as being driven by predictable, almost mechanistic natural forces? It feels like a real point of tension within the framework itself.
It absolutely is a crucial tension. The source criticizes others for only following one framework, arguing you need to see the convergence of many. Okay, fair enough. But is its own synthesis logically consistent? If manipulation groups are deliberately creating events and timing them to align with natural cycle instability to achieve their own goals, as the source suggests, well, does that mean the timing and nature of crises aren't as predictably cyclical as the natural patterns might suggest on their own? It makes the system sound less like clockwork and more like, a battleground where natural cycles provide opportunities for deliberate intervention. And then there are the specific predictions the article makes. The 2025 solar influence, the 2025-2028 economic collapse, the 2023-2030 famine risk. How much confidence should we really place in these concrete timelines based solely on the general descriptions of these cycles and the historical correlations shown on that particular graph? Seems like a big leap.
Right.